There exists a pattern so consistent throughout human history that to ignore it borders on willful blindness. I have spent decades studying the rise and fall of civilizations, from ancient Rome to modern Europe, and one truth emerges with startling clarity: societies that abandon their moral foundations invariably descend into chaos. This isn't mere religious sentiment, it's observable historical fact. When nations systematically reject transcendent authority, they create vacuums that lesser gods rush to fill: the state, ideology, material pleasure, or raw power. The 20th century gave us the most dramatic demonstrations of this principle, yet we seem determined to repeat the experiment. From my years observing the intellectual currents that shape our world, I've witnessed how the abandonment of God creates not liberation, but new forms of tyranny. Today's cultural upheavals aren't random social phenomena, they're predictable consequences of systematic rejection of divine authority. The question isn't whether societies can survive without God, but whether they can survive the gods they create to replace Him. History provides the answer, if we're brave enough to examine it honestly. Chapter 1: The Roman Lesson: When Virtue Dies, Empire Follows. The decline of Rome offers perhaps history's most instructive example of what happens when a civilization loses its moral bearings. In my research into the patterns of historical collapse, I've been struck by how Rome's political decay mirrored its spiritual deterioration. The early republic succeeded precisely because it maintained what the Romans called pietas, reverence for the gods, ancestors, and sacred traditions that bound society together. Marcus Tullius Cicero, writing during the Republic's death throes, understood this connection between religious reverence and political stability. The gods exist, he declared, because nature herself has imprinted a conception of them upon the minds of men. When Romans began treating their ancestral gods as mere superstition, they didn't become more rational, they became more susceptible to political charlatans promising earthly salvation. The transformation was gradual but decisive. As traditional Roman religion lost its hold on the educated classes, foreign cults proliferated. Mystery religions from the East promised personal salvation while demanding nothing of public virtue. Citizens sought private enlightenment while abandoning civic responsibility. The result was predictable: a republic that had conquered the Mediterranean world could no longer govern itself. Consider the contrast between early Roman leaders and their imperial successors. Men like Cincinnatus returned to their farms after saving the state, viewing power as burden rather than prize. But when transcendent accountability disappeared, power became its own justification. Emperors demanded worship not because they believed in their divinity, but because divine status served political control. The Christian transformation of Rome presents fascinating irony. Constantine's conversion didn't represent capitulation to a declining empire, but recognition that only transcendent authority could restore moral foundations. Early Christians possessed what pagans had lost: absolute standards that made heroes of martyrs and cowards of those who compromised principle for convenience. Yet even Christianity couldn't permanently immunize Rome against moral decay. When the Church itself became corrupted by worldly power, it lost its capacity to provide moral leadership. The barbarian invasion succeeded not because Germanic tribes possessed superior military technology, but because they retained tribal virtues that Romans had abandoned: loyalty, honor, courage, and reverence for sacred obligations. The lesson transcends religious specifics. Societies require transcendent reference points to sustain civic virtue. When citizens believe their highest obligations are to themselves, their tribe, or their state, they lose the capacity for the kind of moral heroism that preserves civilization against its inevitable challenges. Chapter 2: The French Revolutionary Terror: Liberty without God becomes tyranny. No historical episode demonstrates more clearly how abandoning God produces chaos than the French Revolution's descent into terror. Having spent considerable time studying revolutionary documents, I'm struck by how quickly Enlightenment ideals transformed into systematic slaughter. The progression wasn't accidental, it was logical consequence of rejecting transcendent moral authority. The revolutionaries began with seemingly noble goals: liberty, equality, fraternity. But notice what they explicitly rejected: Christian foundations that had made these concepts meaningful. When Robespierre and his associates abolished Christianity, they didn't create a vacuum, they established new gods. Reason became deity, the state became church, and revolutionary ideology became sacred doctrine immune to questioning. The cult of reason reveals the revolutionary mindset with startling clarity. They literally enthroned an actress as goddess of reason in Notre Dame Cathedral, complete with worshipful ceremonies. This wasn't mere symbolism, it represented systematic attempt to replace divine authority with human constructions. But reason detached from moral foundations becomes mere rationalization for whatever those in power desire. Consider how revolutionary virtue operated in practice. Robespierre spoke endlessly about virtue while ordering thousands to the guillotine. The Committee of Public Safety promised safety while creating unprecedented terror. They declared universal human rights while denying basic humanity to anyone designated as enemy of the people. Without transcendent standards, virtue became whatever served revolutionary goals. The September massacres of 1792 illustrate the practical consequences. When Parisian mobs murdered over 1,000 prisoners, revolutionary leaders didn't condemn the slaughter, they justified it as necessary defense of liberty. Priests, nobles, and ordinary citizens who questioned revolutionary orthodoxy were labeled enemies of humanity itself. Murder became virtue when performed for correct ideological reasons. Most revealing was the revolutionaries' treatment of time itself. They abolished the Christian calendar, renaming months and weeks according to revolutionary principles. This wasn't mere administrative reform, it represented an attempt to erase historical memory and create new humanity independent of divine providence. When men try to remake time, they're attempting to usurp divine prerogatives. The tragedy deepened as revolutionary logic consumed its own creators. Robespierre himself went to the guillotine, victim of the same arbitrary standards he had imposed on others. Without transcendent law, revolutionary justice became indistinguishable from revenge. Each faction claimed to represent true virtue while eliminating rivals with identical claims. Napoleon's rise represented an inevitable conclusion of this process. When society abandons God, it eventually embraces Caesar. Napoleon understood that revolutionary chaos had exhausted France's capacity for self-government. He provided order, but at the cost of liberty the revolution had promised. The great irony was that Frenchmen welcomed despotism as relief from revolutionary virtue. The terror wasn't aberration, it was logical result of systematic rejection of divine authority. When human will becomes ultimate standard, those with strongest wills dominate those with weaker ones. Liberty without God becomes license, equality becomes leveling, and fraternity becomes factional warfare. Chapter 3: Christian Foundations of Western Freedom, Why Faith Built Civilization. The greatest irony of our secular age is how systematically it denies the Christian foundations of the very freedoms it claims to cherish. After decades studying the development of Western institutions, I can state with confidence that constitutional government, individual rights, and rule of law emerged directly from Christian theological concepts. To abandon Christianity while expecting to preserve its fruits represents historical amnesia of breathtaking proportions. Consider the concept of human dignity that underlies all democratic governance. This wasn't Greek or Roman innovation. Classical civilizations accepted slavery, infanticide, and despotic rule as natural conditions. The radical idea that every human being possesses inherent worth came from Christian teaching that man is created in God's image. Without this theological foundation, human rights become mere social conventions subject to political revision. The medieval development of limited government illustrates this principle beautifully. When kings claimed divine right to absolute rule, Christian scholars responded that divine authority actually limited royal power. Thomas Aquinas argued that human law must conform to divine law, creating space for legitimate resistance to tyrannical authority. This wasn't secular political theory, it was Christian theology applied to governance. The English constitutional tradition that inspired American democracy emerged from centuries of Christian resistance to unlimited state power. When Archbishop Thomas Becket opposed Henry II's attempts to subordinate church to state, he wasn't defending institutional privilege, he was asserting transcendent authority that limited royal prerogatives. Magna Carta itself reflected Christian understanding that even kings must answer to higher law. American founders explicitly acknowledged these Christian foundations. John Adams declared that the Constitution was designed only for moral and religious people, recognizing that self-government requires internal restraints that only transcendent authority can provide. George Washington's farewell address warned that national morality couldn't survive without religious principles. They understood what our contemporary culture has forgotten: freedom requires virtue, and virtue requires transcendent foundation. The abolition of slavery demonstrates Christianity's civilizing power. While secular philosophers like Aristotle defended slavery as natural institution, Christian teaching contained principles that ultimately destroyed it. The recognition that all humans share common divine origin made slavery theologically untenable, even when economic interests resisted moral logic. William Wilberforce and other Christian abolitionists succeeded precisely because they appealed to transcendent standards that trumped material considerations. Modern university education illustrates the same pattern. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and other great institutions began as Christian colleges designed to train ministers. The medieval university system that created Western intellectual tradition emerged from cathedral schools dedicated to understanding divine truth. The scientific revolution itself was powered by Christian conviction that rational God had created comprehensible universe. When universities abandoned Christian foundations, they didn't become more rational, they became centers of ideological indoctrination. The welfare system that secular liberals champion represents secularized Christian charity. The hospital, orphanage, and school systems that care for society's most vulnerable members emerged from Christian understanding of obligation to serve others. When government assumes these responsibilities while rejecting their theological foundations, charity becomes bureaucratic entitlement and compassion becomes political manipulation. Today's assault on religious freedom represents fundamental misunderstanding of civilization's foundations. Constitutional protection for religious conscience wasn't designed to privatize faith, but to protect the source of moral authority that makes constitutional government possible. When religious conviction is reduced to private preference, public life loses access to transcendent standards necessary for justice and liberty. Chapter 4: Modern Intellectuals, the Betrayal of Truth for Ideology. Few phenomena in modern history disturb me more than the systematic betrayal of truth by the very intellectuals entrusted with its preservation. Having spent my early career among these academic and literary elites, I witnessed firsthand how brilliant minds can become servants of destructive ideologies when they abandon transcendent truth for temporal power. The 20th century's greatest tragedies weren't caused by ignorant masses, but by educated intellectuals who subordinated truth to ideological convenience. Consider the shocking case of Western intellectuals' romance with totalitarian regimes. George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, and countless other literary figures praised Stalin's Soviet Union while millions died in forced famines and labor camps. These weren't simple factual errors, they represented willful blindness driven by ideological commitment. When intellectuals convinced themselves that socialist goals justified any means, they became accomplices to unprecedented evil. The pattern reveals itself clearly when examining individual cases. Jean-Paul Sartre, Perhaps the most influential intellectual of his generation, spent decades defending communist tyranny while condemning democratic societies as fundamentally corrupt. His existentialist philosophy, which rejected transcendent moral standards, left him defenseless against political seduction. Without absolute truth as reference point, even brilliant minds mistake oppression for liberation. Simone de Beauvoir's case proves equally instructive. Her feminist philosophy promised women's liberation while she herself lived as intellectual slave to Sartre's domineering influence. The personal hypocrisy wasn't incidental, it reflected philosophical confusion about human nature and moral obligation. When intellectuals reject divine foundations of human dignity, they become vulnerable to ideologies that promise earthly salvation while delivering spiritual bondage. The academic world's transformation during the 20th century illustrates this betrayal on institutional scale. Universities that once sought truth regardless of political consequences became centers of ideological conformity. Professors who questioned progressive orthodoxies faced professional destruction, while those who parroted fashionable opinions received advancement and acclaim. The result was intellectual corruption that undermined education's fundamental purpose. Perhaps most disturbing is how contemporary intellectuals continue these patterns while claiming moral superiority over their predecessors. Today's academic elites condemn historical figures for moral failings while embracing ideologies that produced unprecedented suffering. They celebrate diversity while enforcing intellectual uniformity, champion tolerance while persecuting dissent, and claim scientific objectivity while subordinating evidence to political goals. The climate change debate exemplifies this intellectual corruption. Rather than engaging honestly with complex scientific questions, academic institutions have declared certain conclusions beyond debate. Scientists who question prevailing orthodoxy face professional ostracism, while those who support approved narratives receive funding and recognition. This isn't scientific method, it's ideological enforcement masquerading as objective inquiry. Gender ideology presents an even more stark example of intellectual betrayal. Academic institutions now teach that biological sex is social construction while human sexual behavior is fixed orientation, precisely the opposite of empirical evidence. When universities abandon biological reality for ideological fantasy, they demonstrate complete abandonment of their truth-seeking mission. The tragedy deepens when considering these intellectuals' influence on broader culture. Their ideas shape educational curricula, media narratives, and political policies that affect millions of lives. When intellectual elites embrace destructive ideologies, entire societies suffer consequences of their folly. The French Revolution's terror, fascist and communist tyrannies, and contemporary cultural upheavals all began with intellectual movements that subordinated truth to power. The solution isn't anti-intellectualism, but return to intellectual honesty grounded in transcendent truth. When scholars recognize divine authority over human reason, they gain both humility before evidence and courage against political pressure. Christian intellectual tradition that built Western civilization offers tested alternative to ideological corruption that characterizes contemporary academia. Truth exists independently of human wishes, and reality doesn't bend to political convenience. Intellectuals who abandon this fundamental principle betray not only their calling, but civilization itself. Chapter 5: Historical Patterns, the Cycle of Decline and Renewal. In my decades of historical study, certain patterns emerge with such consistency that ignoring them becomes willful blindness. Societies follow predictable cycles. They begin with strong moral foundations, achieve prosperity and power, grow complacent and corrupted, abandon their founding principles, and eventually collapse or face renewal through spiritual awakening. Understanding these patterns isn't mere academic exercise, it's essential for societies hoping to avoid their predecessors' mistakes. The cycle typically begins with a generation that embraces transcendent truth and builds institutions reflecting divine authority. These founders often emerge from periods of crisis that stripped away illusions about human nature and revealed need for higher guidance. They create laws, customs, and institutions designed to channel human nature toward constructive rather than destructive ends. Their success comes precisely from recognizing human limitations and designing systems that account for moral weakness. Prosperity inevitably follows when societies operate according to divine principles. Hard work, honesty, family stability, and concern for future generations produce material abundance and cultural flowering. Art, literature, science, and philosophy reach heights of achievement as human creativity operates within moral frameworks that direct talent toward worthy ends. The society attracts admiration from neighbors and becomes model for emulation. But success plants seeds of eventual corruption. Generations raised in prosperity take their advantages for granted and begin questioning restrictions that made prosperity possible. They view moral standards as arbitrary limitations rather than practical wisdom accumulated through experience. Education shifts from transmitting tested truth to questioning everything, eventually producing intellectual classes that pride themselves on rejecting their ancestors' primitive beliefs. The abandonment of transcendent authority follows predictable stages. First, intellectual elites declare independence from divine law while maintaining its moral conclusions. They argue that human reason alone can determine right and wrong, conveniently ignoring that their rational conclusions happen to match Christian teaching. This stage can last for generations, creating illusion that secular morality provides adequate foundation for civilization. Eventually, however, the logical implications of rejecting divine authority become apparent. If no transcendent truth exists, then moral standards become mere social conventions subject to revision by whoever holds power. Progressive intellectuals embrace this conclusion enthusiastically, viewing traditional morality as a oppressive obstacle to human liberation. They promise that abandoning outdated restrictions will produce unprecedented human flourishing. The results prove consistently destructive. Family structures collapse as marriage becomes temporary arrangement based on individual satisfaction rather than sacred commitment. Crime increases as personal desire takes precedence over social obligation. Political corruption spreads as leaders recognize no authority higher than their own ambition. Educational institutions abandon their mission of transmitting wisdom and become centers of ideological indoctrination. Social decay accelerates as each generation pushes beyond the limits its predecessors respected. What one generation accepts reluctantly, the next embraces enthusiastically. Behaviors that shock parents become normal for children, who then push boundaries even further. The society enters a spiral of moral decline that eventually threatens its survival. At this point, societies face choice between renewal and collapse. Some choose renewal through spiritual awakening that reconnects them with transcendent truth. The Great Awakening in 18th century America illustrates this possibility beautifully. When colonial society faced moral and spiritual crisis, religious revival restored commitment to divine authority and prepared Americans for the challenges of independence and self-government. Other societies choose continued decline, either through gradual decay or violent revolution. The French Revolution exemplifies this path. When French elites systematically rejected Christian foundations, they created chaos that ultimately required authoritarian restoration. Contemporary Europe may be following similar trajectory, as societies that abandon Christianity struggle with demographic collapse, cultural confusion, and political instability. The key insight for contemporary observers is that these patterns aren't inevitable, they're choices. Societies can break cycles of decline through deliberate return to transcendent foundations. But this requires recognizing that human nature hasn't changed, and the principles that built successful civilizations remain valid regardless of technological advancement or cultural sophistication. History offers hope precisely because it reveals that renewal remains possible for societies willing to humble themselves before transcendent truth. Chapter 6: Providence in History: When Human Plans Meet Divine Purpose. One of the most profound discoveries in my historical research has been recognizing patterns that suggest purpose beyond human planning. Time and again, events unfold in ways that serve larger designs despite the intentions of the participants. This isn't mere coincidence or wishful thinking, it's observable phenomenon that demands explanation. The Christian concept of providence offers the most coherent framework for understanding how individual choices and historical accidents combine to produce outcomes that serve transcendent purposes. Consider the remarkable circumstances surrounding America's founding. The intellectual, political, and economic conditions necessary for constitutional government converged in a remote colonial setting during a brief historical window. The founders themselves recognized divine providence in their success, viewing independence and constitutional creation as manifestations of higher purpose. George Washington's survival through numerous military disasters, the miraculous survival of the Constitutional Convention despite deep disagreements, and the precise timing of key events all suggest coordination beyond human capacity. The defeat of Nazi Germany provides even more striking example. Hitler's empire seemed unstoppable in 1940, controlling most of Europe and allied with Soviet Union and Imperial Japan. Yet a series of seemingly minor decisions, Hitler's invasion of Russia, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, weather conditions during crucial battles, combined to produce Axis destruction. Winston Churchill, whose warnings about fascism were ignored for years, found himself in position to rally democratic resistance precisely when leadership was most needed. The collapse of Soviet communism illustrates the same pattern. For decades, communist ideology appeared to be winning the historical struggle against free societies. Western intellectuals predicted capitalism's inevitable demise while totalitarian regimes expanded globally. Yet the system that promised scientific socialism collapsed suddenly due to internal contradictions its architects never anticipated. The timing allowed peaceful transition rather than nuclear catastrophe that many experts feared. These patterns don't suggest divine micromanagement of historical events, but rather that moral laws operate in human affairs with same consistency as physical laws operate in nature. Societies that align themselves with transcendent principles tend to prosper over time, while those that violate fundamental moral truths eventually face consequences of their choices. Providence works through natural processes rather than miraculous interventions, making divine guidance compatible with human freedom and responsibility. The role of exceptional individuals in these providential patterns deserves special attention. Leaders like Lincoln, Churchill, and Reagan appeared when their unique combinations of character and circumstance were most needed. Their personal qualities, courage, wisdom, moral clarity, enabled them to recognize and respond to historical moments in ways that served purposes beyond their immediate understanding. They became instruments of providence precisely because their character made them suitable for transcendent purposes. Understanding providence doesn't eliminate human responsibility, it enhances it. When we recognize that our choices contribute to larger patterns of meaning, we gain both humility about our limitations and confidence about our significance. Individual actions matter precisely because they participate in cosmic drama between good and evil, truth and falsehood, freedom and tyranny. This perspective transforms how we view contemporary challenges. Current cultural upheavals aren't random social phenomena, but part of larger historical pattern in which societies choose between transcendent truth and human autonomy. The outcome isn't predetermined, but depends on whether enough individuals choose to align themselves with divine purposes rather than personal convenience. The study of providence also provides comfort during periods of apparent defeat. When evil seems triumphant and good people suffer, historical perspective reveals that temporary setbacks often serve larger purposes. The persecution of early Christians spread gospel throughout Roman Empire, the destruction of European Jewry led to Israel's establishment, and communist oppression ultimately strengthened faith in societies where it seemed defeated. Providence operates through human agency rather than despite it, making historical study both humbling and inspiring. We cannot control outcomes, but we can choose whether to serve transcendent purposes or selfish interests. History judges these choices not by immediate success, but by contribution to patterns that serve divine justice and human flourishing. Chapter 7: America's Choice: Renewal or Decline in the 21st Century. As I observe America's current trajectory, I'm struck by how precisely it fits historical patterns of civilizational crisis. The United States stands at the same crossroads that have confronted every great society, whether to restore transcendent foundations or continue the drift toward moral relativism and cultural decay. The choice will determine not only America's future, but the fate of Western civilization itself. Having studied similar moments throughout history, I can say with confidence that the outcome isn't inevitable, but the window for reversal is closing rapidly. America's founding generation understood that their experiment in self-government required moral foundations that only transcendent authority could provide. They built a constitutional system designed for people who recognized divine law as ultimate standard of justice. John Adams's famous observation that the Constitution was designed only for moral and religious people wasn't mere sentiment, it was practical recognition that democratic institutions depend on citizen virtue that secular education cannot sustain. For 2 centuries, this formula worked brilliantly. Despite periodic crises and moral failures, America maintained enough connection to transcendent truth to correct its course and extend liberty's promises to previously excluded groups. The abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, and civil rights movement all drew moral authority from Christian teachings about human dignity and divine justice. Even Americans who weren't personally religious operated within cultural frameworks shaped by biblical values. The systematic abandonment of these foundations began in earnest during the 1960s, when intellectual elites declared independence from traditional morality while maintaining its behavioral expectations. They promised that human reason and scientific method could provide adequate guidance for complex moral questions, ignoring millennia of evidence about reason's limitations when untethered from transcendent truth. The results have been predictably destructive. Family structure has collapsed as marriage became temporary arrangement based on individual satisfaction rather than sacred commitment. Children increasingly grow up without fathers, creating cycles of poverty and dysfunction that government programs cannot address. Educational institutions that once transmitted civilizational wisdom now indoctrinate students in ideologies that undermine the foundations of free society. Media and entertainment industries promote values that would have shocked previous generations. Most alarming is the systematic rejection of biological reality in favor of ideological fantasy. When a society cannot agree on basic facts about human nature, that there are 2 sexes, that children need both mothers and fathers, that some behaviors produce better outcomes than others, it has lost capacity for rational discourse about complex questions. This isn't progress, it's civilizational dementia. The political consequences are becoming apparent as constitutional norms erode under pressure from activists who view traditional limitations as obstacles to social transformation. Free speech, religious liberty, and due process rights, pillars of democratic governance, face systematic assault from groups that claim to defend democracy while undermining its foundations. When political opponents become enemies to be destroyed rather than citizens to be persuaded, democratic discourse becomes impossible. Yet history provides reason for hope precisely because similar crises have produced renewal when societies rediscover transcendent foundations. The Great Awakening prepared America for independence by restoring commitment to divine authority over human power. The abolition movement drew moral energy from Christian conviction that slavery violated divine law. The civil rights movement succeeded because it appealed to transcendent standards that transcended regional customs and racial prejudices. Contemporary America possesses advantages that make renewal possible if enough citizens choose to pursue it. Religious freedom still exists despite growing restrictions, allowing faith communities to maintain alternative vision of human flourishing. Constitutional framework remains intact despite progressive attempts to circumvent it through judicial activism and administrative overreach. Most importantly, millions of Americans retain connection to transcendent truth despite cultural pressure to abandon traditional beliefs. The path forward requires deliberate choice to restore transcendent foundations in education, family life, and political discourse. This doesn't mean theocracy or sectarian control, but recognition that moral truth exists independently of human preferences and that sustainable freedom requires virtue grounded in divine authority. Parents must reclaim responsibility for their children's moral education. Citizens must engage in political process guided by transcendent principles, and religious communities must recover confidence in their civilizational mission. The alternative is continued decline toward the chaos that has consumed every society that abandoned its moral foundations. America can avoid this fate, but only through deliberate choice to reverse course while reversal remains possible. Conclusion. The lesson of history speaks with unmistakable clarity. Societies that abandon God inevitably face chaos, while those that return to transcendent foundations discover renewal beyond their immediate circumstances. This isn't religious sentiment but observable fact validated across centuries and cultures. The choice before us isn't between progress and tradition, but between order and anarchy, meaning and meaninglessness, hope and despair. Every generation faces this fundamental decision. Our ancestors who built Western civilization understood that human freedom requires divine foundation, that justice demands transcendent standard, and that sustainable prosperity flows from moral virtue rather than material accumulation. They weren't perfect, but they possessed wisdom we desperately need, recognition that human nature requires external guidance and that societies ignoring divine law eventually destroy themselves. The contemporary crisis offers opportunity disguised as catastrophe. When traditional institutions fail and cultural certainties collapse, people become open to truths they previously ignored. History's greatest renewals often emerge from periods of apparent defeat, when human pride is humbled and societies rediscover their need for divine guidance. Our responsibility is clear: to choose transcendent truth over temporal convenience, to defend moral foundations against intellectual fashion, and to prepare the next generation for challenges that require character rather than cleverness. The outcome isn't guaranteed, but history teaches that individuals committed to divine purposes can influence events far beyond their apparent power. The God who guided our ancestors through previous crises remains available to guide us through current challenges. The question isn't whether divine providence operates in human affairs, but whether we possess wisdom to align ourselves with purposes that transcend our immediate understanding. History awaits our answer.